Now we're going to have a very interesting conversation with two people who probably disagree. Peter Morici is a professor at Smith School of Business, University of Maryland. He's a former chief economist at the U.S. International Trade Commission. And David K. Johnston is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer who now works with Reuters. I want to welcome both of you. And Peter, let me start with you. We're going to talk about how we got into this deficit problem in the first place, and based on something you wrote. But obviously, big news today. So I wanted to ask you guys both quickly what you thought of the deal. Peter, what's your thoughts on the debt ceiling deal we had today?
Well, you know, it was one of those things where nobody was happy. I mean, to listen to the Tea Party people, they were unhappy. They felt that they didn't accomplish as much as they thought they should. And you played some clips from, you know, folks on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and they thought they'd been sold down the river by their president, or at least by the circumstances that compelled him to take the actions they did. I would point out that, you know, even the most militant among them, or most disappointed, let's use more appropriate language, you know, felt that he was still their president and he was doing the best they could. So I guess nobody was happy.
Okay. Well, obviously I disagree. I am among the most progressive, let's put it that way, and I don't think he's our president at all. I think he is not at all progressive. He's our president in terms of we're all United States citizens. I totally respect that. But if you think he's a progressive president, I think he's miles away from that. And by the way, just a point of clarity, the Tea Party wound up voting, according to Nate Silver's count, 32-28 in favor of this bill. So they weren't as dissatisfied as they pretended to be. And David, what's your analysis on this bill?
Well, this was a completely manufactured and phony crisis of absolutely no necessity. I'm in Singapore, where quite literally people, when you bring this up with them, are astonished at the farce that they see in Washington. The way the decision has come out, it is the best funded programs with dedicated income streams, Social Security and Medicare, that are under the greatest assault, even though they have dedicated funding streams that can be adjusted as well as other things about those programs. And it is completely unbalanced. Just as a business can't get to prosperity by cutting, the federal government cannot continue this practice of having the very wealthiest Americans have a much smaller tax burden than middle-class Americans. And so it's completely unbalanced.
Right. Okay. So now, Peter, I know you wrote about how we got into this mess. My sense of how we got into this mess and the fact that we had to raise the debt ceiling in the first place is because of spending we already did, which we all agree on, of course. And the spending we already did, it seems, is over $1 trillion for the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, about $1.3 trillion, I believe. And then that could rise by some estimates all the way up to $3 trillion, depending on what you take into account, et cetera. And then you've got, of course, the Bush tax cuts, which were gigantic. But your contention is that's not how we got in this mess. So I found that really interesting. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, if we go back to 2007, the last year before the crisis, we had the wars going on, and we had the Bush tax cut, and we also had Bush's pharmaceutical, the drug benefit for seniors, and the deficit was only $161 billion. Now, we also had Social Security at that time and Medicaid at that time, and the deficit was only $161 billion. A substantial deficit, but only 1/10 of what we have now. Now, we have increased spending dramatically since then, and not for the war, but for other things, and we haven't adequately funded them. And we've gotten to the point where we've got basically two choices. One is to, because I don't believe any of the budget projections that either president has put out. I think we're in much worse fiscal shape going down the road, even with the wars ending, than those projections would indicate, but we can come back to that. We have two choices. We can raise taxes by about 10% of GDP. That's what $1.6 trillion is. And that would mean, say, a 12, 13, 14% value-added tax, because not everything would be in a value-added tax, or, you know, an income tax that's even larger than that, because not everything gets captured as income in an income tax. Or to moderate spending somewhat. Now, you know, David referred to, you know, stuff with dedicated income streams. Let's take Social Security. People are living a lot longer. When you get to 65, you got a decent chance of living another 20 years. You got about a 50% chance of living another 20 years. So I don't think it's unreasonable to say that Americans should say, work longer. You know, I'm 62. I plan on working beyond 66, you know, maybe 70. And then you'd have a somewhat shorter retirement, but still, some retirement. I think those are reasonable sacrifices to make. When I look at the other things the government does, and I don't want to go on too much longer because I want to give everybody a chance. I want everybody to have a chance. This is your show. What the American government does for its people is not unreasonable when you look at other advanced industrialized countries. But I think we do it pretty badly. And I'm not anti-government, but I look at health care and how much we spend on health care in the United States and say how much the Germans spend, which is, considerably less.
Right.
But yet they get better outcomes.
Yeah,
so,
well, let's stay, because the government is far more involved.
Make better cars.
Well, yeah, the government's far more involved in German healthcare. But I want to let David respond because you made a lot of points there. David K. Johnston, go ahead.
Well, Peter and I, who both teach at business schools, agree on a lot of points. But on this one, I think we have some very sharp disagreements. First of all, it's true that in the peak year of the economy, the deficit was much smaller. We were living in an economy that was being fueled by bad economics and by awful non-regulatory events. And if you look at the CBO reports, it shows that basically the cost of these bad policies of not regulating the banks are adding $8.6 trillion to our debt. All you have to do is look at the CBO projections from January of 2008, compare them to January of 2009. The deficit is there partly because we have stabilizers. When lots of people are out of work, they get unemployment benefits. Peter suggests working later. Well, I don't ever plan to retire, but you know what? I have an office job just like you and Peter. But what about people who are factory workers? What about people who employers will not hire because their hair is gray? We have to have a system that recognizes that everybody doesn't have a high education and an office job. And finally, we need to remember that in healthcare, where Peter and I are in agreement that the costs versus the outcomes are completely indefensible, the fundamental reason for that is that we have a healthcare sick care system driven by profit instead of public service. If we ran the kindergartens in America, the way we run healthcare, every kindergarten teacher would spend several hours a day filling out paperwork. I gave 7 green crayons to boys today, but only 4 to girls, and the reason for that difference is we need to have a rational healthcare system, and if we fix healthcare alone, the budget deficit goes away. All
right, Peter, I want to talk about a couple of things that David just mentioned and throw a couple of my own in. You say in 2007, the budget deficit wasn't that bad, but 3 things that I want you to address. One is, President Bush had a $500 billion surplus to work with, and he turned that into a deficit in 2007. And in 2007, we were at the height of the bubble. And so obviously the bubble at some point was going to blow up, which it did, and then it led to these disastrous consequences, which made the deficit much worse. In fact, when President Obama got into office, he was dealing with a $1.2 trillion deficit. And finally, look, a lot of these actions, like the wars and the tax cuts, are backloaded. So the wars' healthcare costs remain forever, for decades and decades. So it's easy to say, well, in 2007, briefly at the height of the bubble, we were okay. But don't you see that the bubble was going to burst? All these costs are backloaded. And by the time Obama came in, there was already a gigantic deficit.
Well, where do you want to start measuring when the Democrats had their impact? In 2007 is when the Democrats took over the Congress, and Bush then had to start dealing. No, hold on, had to start dealing with a Democratic Congress, and that did change things. But I mean, we went through the recession, and we've come out now, and we shouldn't really have deficits this large. But one of the things that we did do going through the recession was spend a lot of money that was supposed to be of a temporary nature, but now it's proven to be permanent. So, we have to look at where we are. Now, if you're going to ask me to defend President Bush's fiscal policy, I'm not going to do that for you. You introduced me as a conservative and a libertarian, not a Republican, all right? I think that he did a great job of squandering a wonderful legacy from Bill Clinton in terms of a healthy economy and a budget surplus. But that isn't the world I'm dealing with right now. I look at the structure of the deficit that we have right now and how much of it is health care.
So, look, let me kick that over to David.
Hold on. I mean, really, either we're going to raise, we have to deal with the problem we've got. Now, either we're going to raise taxes by 10% of GDP, or we're going to have to start cutting. Now, what I'm advocating is doing things better. I'm not advocating giving people less benefits. I want to reform healthcare, but straightening out healthcare alone won't solve it. We would probably get back about 5% of GDP that way. We wouldn't get back the whole bloody deficit, and the whole bloody deficit is 10% of GDP. So we're going to have to start cutting some other things, and I think Social Security is a good place, not so much because I want to give people less benefits, but they're getting more benefits than they used to because they're living longer. So we're going to have to, and we'll have to deal with some of the issues David talks about people who can't work to 75 because they're not professors the way we are. But on the other hand, we have a lot of people who are retiring awfully young, and I don't know that is wholly appropriate.
All right, David, let me kick some of those ideas of Peter's over to you. So first of all, Obama did come in with a $1.2 trillion deficit left by Bush, but how much of it is Obama going forward? I think that's a fair question. And then, Peter says in order to make up the $1.6 trillion, we'd have to raise taxes by 10% of GDP. Could we raise taxes? Would we have to raise them that much, given that the Bush tax cuts cost us $1.7 trillion?
Well, right now, taxes are running less than 15% of GDP. The historic average is 18%. So clearly, we can afford some tax increases. And when we have people who have multi-billion-dollar annual incomes who at least through 2009 paid no current tax, and we don't know yet because the data's not in whether that's still true, we certainly have people who can afford to bear a higher tax burden for the good of the country. In the long run, we have to balance our budget. But more importantly, we have to have policies that create jobs. I'm in Singapore right now, Cenk. The government here has announced that it will strive to increase in real terms incomes by 30% over the next decade. In America, the median wage of workers has been stuck now for 10 years at just over $26,000 a year. We are pursuing tax and business policies in America that are destroying wealth overall, that are piling up what wealth there is to a very narrow class of people at the top. We are draining and using up our infrastructure instead of reinvesting in it. And we have politicians debating nonsense that we don't have to have a debate about at all, as we saw with this debt ceiling, because the public has stood by and said, well, I'd rather be interested in who Jennifer Lopez is dating this week than dealing with the real underlying issues. We certainly need to make some adjustments to Social Security to recognize changes that have taken place in our society. That's a minor problem to solve. Well, the other thing we have to keep in mind is the real cost of bailing out Wall Street instead of letting these failed executives go broke, and I'm pretty sure Peter will agree with me about this, that was a terrible decision to, at a minimum, if we had to save them for some reason, to not save them only in the sense of protecting the economy. They are right back to what they were doing before. They will create another financial crisis sooner or later, and the cost of it we can pretty well assess. It's about $8 trillion of added debt to the federal government.
Look, I hope we all agree on that, and that was a bipartisan disaster. Bush started it, Obama continued it, I wish conservatives and libertarians would actually protest against that. But Peter, final question goes to you. We are at 14% of GDP for taxes. It is a historically low rate. In fact, I read an article in Bloomberg News talking about how our Treasury bonds are still at incredibly low interest rates because investors believe we can raise taxes so much more that we have room to raise those taxes, and hence we're not really in as much fiscal trouble as it would appear from the outside. Do you agree that given the tax rates being historically low, we certainly could raise them?
Yes, we could. One of the problems of raising taxes on upper income individuals is there are a lot of people who are paying, 60% marginal rates because they don't have the privileges that Wall Street hedge fund traders have. The real problem in raising more taxes is the unfairness of the system, in that some people, with similar incomes pay a great deal of tax and others don't pay very much by virtue of where they are in the economy and what benefits are bestowed on that industry. Trading on Wall Street is essentially taxed at the capital gains rate, even when people don't have any capital invested. So there is, I agree with David that just as he agrees with me about we need to make adjustments in Social Security, we need to make adjustments in taxes. And my feeling is that if we stop worrying about the mistakes of past presidents and current presidents and look at the 10% of GDP we have to find, that if we did a real job of straightening out health care and we did a real job of straightening out our schools and a real job of straightening out our tax system, that we could get all these things done, and as I said earlier, provide people with the level of government service they deserve and should expect by the standards of other countries that do things better than we do.
Well, we're out of time, but since it's my show, I get the last word. Look, if you're talking, it depends on how, and I'm not worried about the past, I'm worried about the future, I'm worried about this deal, I'm worried about the super Congress and what they're going to do. If you say by tweaking Social Security, you mean raising the amount that people pay in after $106,000 of income, I'm with you. If you say raising the retirement age, I'm not with you. You know, and the list goes on and on for how you tweak these things and how you change these things. You know, you want to lower healthcare costs? As you pointed out, the Germans have a better model. They use the government a lot more. A public option would have lowered costs possibly tremendously, depending on how wide it was. But we didn't go in that direction. So there are smart ways of doing this. Unfortunately, the Republicans, I don't think, have those smart ways, and the Democrats keep agreeing with them. That is my opinion. You just heard the opinion of Peter Morici. He's a professor at Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. And David K. Johnston, Pulitzer Prize-winning writer now with Reuters. Thank you both for joining us. We really do appreciate it.
All the best.
All right.
Take care.